Reports now reaching senior members of the royal household claim that DNA samples linked to Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor do not align with the expected paternal markers. In plain English, the children who were presented as Harry's blood heirs may not be his biological children at all. And if that is true, every title, every security detail, every claim to the line of succession rests on a foundation of sand. Prince William, according to those same sources, has had enough. The man who will one day be king is said to have made it clear, if the blood is not royal, the titles should not be either. Strip them, quietly if possible, publicly if necessary. The institution cannot afford another layer of deception. This is not gossip from a tabloid. This is the kind of conversation that happens behind closed doors at the highest levels when the monarchy's very legitimacy is at stake. Let us go back. Meghan Markle arrived on the scene with a carefully curated origin story. The self-made Hollywood success, the progressive heroine, the woman who would heal the firm. What followed was a masterclass in narrative control. Pregnancies announced with maximum drama, births conducted in near-total secrecy, photographs released on their own schedule, access denied to almost everyone who might ask inconvenient questions. Independent royal observers noted the oddities years ago. The absence of traditional hospital appearances, the extreme privacy surrounding the children's early months, the refusal to allow the kind of routine public confirmation that previous generations took for granted. At the time it was dismissed as modern parenting or trauma from press intrusion. Now those same choices look less like caution and more like concealment. A surrogate pregnancy is not illegal. It is not even particularly rare among the wealthy. What is rare, and what is radioactive inside the British monarchy, is presenting a surrogate child as a blood heir to the throne, and allowing that child to carry titles that rest on bloodline. The line of succession is not a branding exercise. It is a constitutional fact. It depends on legitimate descent. If Archie and Lilibet are not Harry's biological children, then the titles Prince and Princess, the places in the order of succession, and the entire public claim of continuity become legally and historically questionable. William understands this. He has spent his entire adult life preparing to protect the institution his grandmother and father handed him. He has watched the Sussexes monetize the family name while simultaneously attacking it. He has watched security costs, legal fees, and reputational damage pile up. The reported DNA discrepancy is not just a personal matter. It is an institutional threat, and Meghan Markle, the woman who built an entire brand on authenticity, now faces the possibility that her most intimate family narrative was the least authentic of all. A 10-year secret, if these reports hold, would mean the pregnancy announcements, the birth stories, the "our children" language in every interview were constructed. Not edited, constructed. That is not a small lie. That is a foundational one. Consider the pattern, the constant repositioning, the simultaneous demand for privacy and the relentless pursuit of publicity. The lawsuits that silence critics while Netflix specials invite the world into their living room on their terms. The insistence that any scrutiny is racism or misogyny, while every commercial opportunity is seized. When the product being sold is family, and the family itself may rest on a biological fiction, the entire enterprise starts to look less like a personal journey and more like a long-running confidence game. Harry, of course, is the tragic figure in this version of events, the spare who was always searching for significance. The man who traded the structured world he understood for a partner who understood narrative better than he ever would. If he knowingly participated in a surrogacy arrangement and allowed the children to be presented as his biological heirs, he has compromised the very institution he still claims to care about. If he did not know, then the deception sits even heavier on the person who controlled the story. Either way, the children themselves become the collateral. Two young people whose identities and public roles may have been built on a carefully maintained falsehood. That is not progressive, that is reckless. The palace has remained silent, as it always does until it cannot, but silence has limits. William's reported insistence on testing is the sound of those limits being reached. A future king cannot preside over a succession that includes individuals whose claim may be biologically void. He cannot allow titles that depend on blood to be held by those who lack it. And he cannot continue to watch the Sussex brand extract value from an institution it simultaneously undermines. This is the moment the fairy tale ends, not with a dramatic confrontation on the steps of Buckingham Palace, not with a tearful interview, but with something far more devastating: the quiet, clinical language of DNA results and the cold constitutional logic that follows. The reports are accurate, then every interview, every documentary, every carefully staged family photograph of the past 5 years was part of a larger performance. The audience was sold a bloodline. What they may have received was a brand. Meghan Markle has always been excellent at controlling the frame. The question now is whether the frame can survive contact with laboratory evidence. The monarchy has survived far worse than one couple's ambition. It has survived abdication, divorce, and open scandal. What it has never had to survive is the open suggestion that the next generation of royals may not be royal by blood at all. That is the line William is drawing, and that is why the panic, if these accounts are true, is real. Archie and Lilibet were presented to the world as the fresh start, the modern chapter, the proof that the old institution could evolve. If the DNA does not match, they become something else entirely. The evidence that the evolution was a fabrication. The titles can be stripped. The security arrangements can be revised, the public narrative can be corrected. What cannot be undone is the damage to trust. For years the Sussexes demanded that the public take them at their word, believe the pregnancy stories, believe the birth accounts, believe the victimhood, believe the love. Belief is no longer enough. Biology has entered the conversation, and biology does not care about Netflix deals or carefully worded statements. The scam of the century was never just about money or attention. It was about blood, about the oldest claim the monarchy has, about the one thing that cannot be rewritten in a press release. The world celebrates, the press goes into overdrive, and then people start watching, not with hostility, not with suspicion, simply with the natural curiosity that accompanies any high-profile pregnancy, and what they see is unusual. Over the following months, Meghan's baby bump becomes the subject of intense public scrutiny, not because the public is cruel, but because the bump appears to change size dramatically, sometimes within the span of a single day. Photographs taken hours apart show what appears to be a significantly different silhouette. On certain occasions, the bump appears to fold or shift in ways that are, to put it diplomatically, inconsistent with human physiology. Now, let us be fair. Pregnancy is different for every woman. Clothing can create optical illusions. Camera angles distort. All of this is true. But the sheer volume of visual inconsistencies became impossible for even casual observers to dismiss entirely. There was the now infamous moment at a public engagement where Meghan appeared to crouch and fold forward in a manner that would be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for a woman in her 3rd trimester. There were the high heels, the bending, the physical agility that seemed, to many experienced mothers watching at home, simply incompatible with late-stage pregnancy. And then there was the birth announcement itself. May 6, 2019. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor is born. But the circumstances surrounding that birth were from the very beginning shrouded in opacity that was unprecedented for a royal baby born that close to the line of succession. No photographs outside the hospital. No confirmation of which hospital was used until well after the fact. No appearance by the attending physician. No traditional photo call on the steps. Instead, a carefully staged introduction days later inside Windsor Castle, with Meghan holding the baby in a manner that some observers noted seemed rehearsed, stiff, as though she were holding an infant for what might have been one of the first times. Now, I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. Every single one of these observations, taken in isolation, has an innocent explanation. Every single one. But taken together as a pattern, as a mosaic, they paint a picture that is, at minimum, worthy of serious inquiry. And serious inquiry is precisely what has been conspicuously absent if the visual questions surrounding Meghan's pregnancies were the smoke. The birth certificate irregularities were the first visible flames. In 2021, it was revealed that Archie's birth certificate had been amended. Meghan's first name was removed and replaced with Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. The name of the hospital, initially listed, became the subject of conflicting reports, and the registrar's details raised questions among legal observers who noted certain procedural irregularities. Now, birth certificates are amended all the time. There are legitimate administrative reasons for changes. But the specific nature and timing of these amendments, coming as they did amid growing public scrutiny, struck many as convenient, more significantly, when journalists and researchers attempted to access the full, unredacted birth records through proper legal channels, they encountered resistance that went beyond standard privacy protections. Freedom of information requests were denied. Legal barriers were erected. And the palace, first Buckingham Palace, then later the Sussex operation itself, declined to provide the kind of straightforward clarification that would have ended the speculation overnight. Think about that for a moment. If the answer to every question was simple and innocent, the simplest response would have been transparency. Show the records, confirm the details, end the story. The fact that the response was instead opacity, legal maneuvering, and carefully worded non-denial denials tells you something. Perhaps not everything, but something. With Lilibet Diana, born in June 2021 in California, the questions only intensified. The birth was announced through the Sussex press operation, not through medical professionals or hospital representatives. No independent confirmation was provided. No photographs were released for an extended period. And when images did eventually emerge, they were controlled, curated, and distributed entirely on the Sussex's own terms. In other words, at no point in the birth and early life of either child has there been a single moment of independent, verifiable, third-party confirmation of the basic facts. For children who stand in the line of succession to the British throne, this is not a minor procedural oversight. It is potentially constitutional matter of the highest order. Let us address the central allegation directly, because it deserves to be stated plainly rather than danced around. A growing body of commentary from investigative researchers, body language analysts, medical professionals, and legal observers has coalesced around a singular hypothesis: that Meghan Markle did not carry either Archie or Lilibet herself, and that the children were instead born via gestational surrogacy. Let us be absolutely clear about what this allegation means and what it does not mean. It does not mean the children don't exist. They clearly do. It does not necessarily mean that Harry is not their biological father. And it does not in itself mean that surrogacy is wrong. Millions of families are built through surrogacy, and there is no shame in it whatsoever. What it does mean, if true, is that a deliberate, sustained deception was perpetrated on the British public, on the royal family, and on the institution of the monarchy. It means that the elaborate performance of pregnancy, the bump, the announcements, the carefully staged photo opportunities, was precisely that, a performance. And it means that fundamental questions about the children's legal status, their place in the line of succession, and the circumstances of their birth have been deliberately obscured from those with every right to know. Now, why would someone do this? What possible motive could exist for such an elaborate deception? The answer, unfortunately, is not complicated. Surrogacy, particularly commercial surrogacy, occupies a complex legal and cultural space in the United Kingdom. Under British law, the surrogate mother is the legal mother at birth, regardless of genetic connection. This creates immediate complications for succession rights, titles, and the legal status of children born into the royal family. More practically, the narrative of pregnancy and motherhood was central to Meghan's public identity during her time as a working royal. The image of the glowing, pregnant duchess, modern, empowered, barrier-breaking, was not just a personal story. It was a brand. And that brand had enormous commercial and social value. If that story was fabricated, then the brand was built on a lie. And that lie has implications that extend far beyond public relations, which brings us to the most explosive element of this story, and the reason we are covering it now. According to reports that have emerged through multiple channels in recent weeks, Prince William, now the Prince of Wales and the direct heir to the throne, has privately communicated through intermediaries and through formal constitutional channels that he believes the question of Archie and Lilibet's parentage must be resolved definitively. And the mechanism he has reportedly advocated for is as simple as it is seismic: DNA testing. Now let us sit with that for a moment. The future King of England is reportedly demanding biological verification of two children who currently sit 5th and 6th in line to his throne. This is not gossip. This is not palace intrigue for entertainment purposes. This is a constitutional matter that strikes at the very heart of the monarchy's legitimacy and the integrity of the line of succession. William's reported position is not personal, it is institutional. As the heir, he has not merely a right, but an obligation to ensure that the line of succession is composed of individuals who are legitimately entitled to be there. If there is any question, any ambiguity, any unresolved doubt about the biological parentage of individuals in that line, the integrity of the entire system is compromised. And here is the uncomfortable truth that defenders of the Sussexes consistently fail to address. If there is nothing to hide, there is nothing to fear from verification. A simple DNA test would end every question, silence every critic, and vindicate Meghan completely. The fact that this straightforward resolution has not been pursued, and indeed has reportedly been resisted with extraordinary vigor, speaks volumes. Or rather, it speaks in the loudest possible silence. What we are looking at, when we step back and view the complete picture, is not a single lie. It is an architecture. A carefully constructed, continuously maintained edifice of secrecy that has been sustained for nearly a decade. Consider the elements: the controlled visual narrative of pregnancy, the unprecedented opacity surrounding the births, the birth certificate amendments, the refusal of independent verification, the aggressive legal responses to anyone who asks questions, the absence of the children from public life, not occasional absence, but near total invisibility. When was the last time anyone outside the Sussex inner circle independently confirmed seeing both children? When has any member of the royal family, any member at all, publicly confirmed details about the children that couldn't have been obtained directly from the Sussex press operation? When has any independent medical professional confirmed the births? The children have appeared in a handful of carefully produced photographs and one Netflix documentary. Every image has been controlled. Every appearance has been managed. Every piece of information has flowed through a single channel: the Sussexes themselves. For the children of a plumber or an accountant, this level of privacy would be unremarkable. But for children in the line of succession to the British throne, children whose identity and parentage have direct constitutional implications, this is not privacy. This is concealment. And there is a profound, legally significant difference between the two. Let us now examine what is actually at stake if these allegations are substantiated. Under the Act of Settlement, the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, and centuries of constitutional precedent, the line of succession is determined by legitimate biological descent. Every individual in that line must meet the legal criteria established by Parliament and maintained through the constitutional framework of the United Kingdom. If Archie and Lilibet were born via surrogacy, their legal status becomes immediately complicated. Under UK law, the surrogate is the legal mother at birth. A parental order would be required to transfer legal parentage, and such an order requires specific conditions to be met, including the involvement of a UK court. If these legal processes were not followed, or if they were followed but concealed, then the children's place in the line of succession may be legally void. Not morally, not emotionally, legally. And the monarchy, whatever its modern ceremonial role, is ultimately a legal institution governed by legal rules established and maintained by Parliament. Furthermore, if it were established that a deliberate deception was perpetrated regarding the circumstances of the children's birth, this could constitute fraud upon the Crown. That is not a tabloid headline. That is a legal concept with real and serious consequences. The Privy Council, the Lord Chancellor, and ultimately Parliament itself would be required to address such a finding. The implications for the monarchy's credibility, for public trust, and for the Sussex family's relationship with every institution they have touched would be incalculable. There is an old legal principle worth remembering here. When an allegation can be easily disproved, and the accused chooses not to disprove it, the inference is not favorable to the accused. Meghan Markle has access to the finest legal minds money can buy. She has access to media platforms, press operations, and public relations machinery that most heads of state would envy. She has on numerous occasions demonstrated an eagerness, even an enthusiasm, for engaging with the press when it serves her purposes. She sat for hours of interviews with Oprah Winfrey. She produced hours of content for Netflix. She has given interviews, made public statements, and issued legal threats with remarkable frequency and considerable success. And yet on this singular question, the question of her children's biological origins, her response has been nothing. Not a denial, not a correction, not a defamation lawsuit against those making the allegations, just silence. Silence and legal barriers and information control. Now perhaps the argument is that the allegations are beneath response. That dignifying them with a denial would give them credibility. Perhaps, but this argument has a shelf life, and after 10 years that shelf life has well and truly expired. The questions have not gone away, they have grown. They have attracted serious attention from serious people. And the continued refusal to provide simple, definitive answers has transformed reasonable questions into reasonable suspicions. So here we are, 10 years on. 2 children whose faces the world has barely seen. A line of succession that may contain individuals with no legal right to be there. A Prince of Wales reportedly demanding verification. A Duchess in Montecito surrounded by lawyers, publicists, and a steadily eroding wall of secrecy. What happens next will define not just the Sussex story, but the future credibility of the monarchy itself. If William's reported demands are pursued through formal channels, through the Privy Council, through constitutional mechanisms, through the courts if necessary, then we are looking at the most significant royal crisis since the abdication. Not because the truth is necessarily scandalous, but because the concealment of truth, whatever that truth may be, has been allowed to metastasize for a decade. And if the truth is what many suspect, that the pregnancies were performed rather than experienced, that the births were managed through surrogacy, and that the public was deliberately misled from the very beginning, then the consequences for Meghan Markle will extend far beyond embarrassment. They will be legal, they will be constitutional, and they will be permanent. The House of Windsor has survived wars, abdications, divorces, and scandals that would have destroyed lesser institutions. It has survived because, at its core, it has always eventually chosen transparency over concealment, duty over convenience, and truth over performance. Meghan Markle chose performance. She chose it from the beginning, and she has chosen it every day since. She built an identity, a brand, a narrative, and a career on stories that are now being examined with a scrutiny she never anticipated and cannot control. And performances, by their nature, eventually end. The curtain, it seems, is finally coming down. This is not an insult dressed as an observation. It is a documented pattern. Multiple production staff, multiple royal aides, multiple members of the Sussex household who later spoke, anonymously and sometimes on record, described the same experience. The warmth that could vanish in an instant. The carefully calibrated public persona that bore little resemblance to what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. The gap between the story being told and the reality being lived. Now, people are complicated. Human beings contain multitudes. The existence of a gap between public persona and private reality is not, in itself, evidence of anything beyond the ordinary complexity of being human. But when that gap extends to the fundamental facts of your family, when that gap encompasses the births of your children. When that gap becomes so wide that the future King of England is reportedly demanding biological proof of parentage, then we are no longer talking about ordinary complexity. We are talking about something else entirely. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the relationship, not the beginning of the engagement, but the beginning of the questions. Because that is where this story actually starts. When Meghan Markle announced her pregnancy in October 2018 during the royal tour of Australia, the reaction from the public was broadly warm. Here was a modern couple, a fairy tale with a contemporary edge, expecting their first child. The optics were good, the timing was good, and the press for once seemed willing to extend generosity rather than scrutiny. But something happened in the months that followed that began to shift the temperature of that generosity. Not dramatically. Not all at once, but incrementally, observation by observation, photograph by photograph, something began to feel wrong. The bump did not behave the way bumps behave. This is the most basic, most fundamental observation, and it is worth dwelling on because the people who made it were not cranks. They were women, millions of them. Women who had been pregnant themselves, who had watched friends and sisters and colleagues go through pregnancy, who understood from lived experience what a growing belly in the third trimester looks, feels, and moves like. And what they were seeing on their television screens and in their newspapers did not match that understanding. The bump was inconsistent in a way that went beyond the normal variation that clothing and angle and light can create. It appeared in certain footage and photographs to behave as though it were external to the body rather than part of it. The famous moment of folding, of bending forward at the waist in a manner that would be genuinely physically impossible for most women at that stage of pregnancy, became a lightning rod for discussion that the palace press operation was entirely unprepared to handle, because the palace press operation's response was not to address the observation, it was to dismiss it. To characterize anyone making it as cruel, as misogynistic, as obsessed. And in characterizing the questioners rather than answering the question, they made a fundamental error of judgment that only amplified the suspicion they were trying to suppress. Here is something worth understanding about the British public in particular. They are, as a general rule, deeply fair-minded. They will extend enormous benefit of the doubt. They will absorb an extraordinary amount of information, process it with considerable patience, and arrive at conclusions slowly and reluctantly. But there is one thing the British public does not forgive, and that is being taken for fools. The moment people began to feel that the visual inconsistencies were not being addressed because they could not be addressed, the temperature changed, quietly, without drama. The way temperatures in Britain tend to change, but it changed, and it has never changed. What the Palace and the Sussex operation consistently failed to understand is that silence in the face of a specific, answerable question is not neutrality. It is communication. It communicates clearly and unmistakably that the question cannot be safely answered, that the answer, if given, would cause more damage than the ongoing speculation, because if the answer was innocent, the answer would have been given. That is the simple logic that no amount of press release language or legal threat can ultimately defeat the birth of Archie in May 2019 should have been, and in a rational world would have been, the moment the questions ended. A healthy baby. A happy family, photographs on the steps, a smiling mother, a proud father, the natural culmination of 9 months of public pregnancy. The moment where all the visual evidence resolves itself into a living, breathing human being, and the story moves forward into its next chapter. That is not what happened. What happened instead was a choreography so tightly controlled, so aggressively managed, so utterly without precedent in the modern history of the monarchy, that it created more questions than it answered. No hospital steps, no public medical confirmation, no independent witnesses. A location that was not disclosed in advance and only partially confirmed afterward. A gathering of family members at Windsor Castle days later, staged with the precision of a film production, where a baby was presented to the world in arms that held him with a stiffness, an unfamiliarity that countless viewers noticed and commented upon. Now, first-time mothers can be nervous holding their newborns in front of cameras. This is entirely true. Postpartum exhaustion can affect a woman's physical ease and comfort. This is also true. Every single individual observation has an innocent explanation sitting right next to it, but the accumulation, the relentless, consistent, patterned accumulation of things that did not quite fit, of moments that did not quite land, of a story that, no matter how many times you smoothed its edges, refused to lie flat, that accumulation does not have an innocent explanation. Or rather, it has one innocent explanation and one that is not innocent at all. And the behavior of every party involved from that day to this has done nothing to make the innocent explanation more convincing. Then came Lilibet. June 2021, California. The world is different now. Harry and Meghan have departed the royal family in circumstances that remain, to put it generously, contested. They are settled in Montecito. They have signed the Netflix deal. The Oprah interview has happened. The carefully constructed victimhood narrative is fully operational and generating considerable revenue. And into this environment, a second child is born, or announced as born, because the distinction, it turns out, matters enormously. The announcement came through the Sussex press operation, not through a hospital, not through a medical professional, not through any independent channel that could be verified or cross-referenced. A statement, a name, a reference to a healthy birth. And then for an extended period, nothing else, no photographs for weeks. And when photographs eventually appeared, they were produced content. Controlled images distributed on Sussex terms, showing what the Sussexes chose to show when they chose to show it in the manner they chose to present it. For a private family with no public role and no connection to any institution requiring transparency, this would be entirely their right. Nobody is owed photographs of someone else's child. Privacy is a legitimate value, but Lilibet Diana is not a private individual. She is, by the rules of the institution her father was born into, and has not formally renounced, sixth in line to the throne of the United Kingdom. Her existence, her parentage, and her legal status are matters of constitutional significance, and constitutional significance cannot be satisfied with a press release. Let us talk about something that does not get discussed enough in this context. Let us talk about the pattern of legal aggression. Meghan Markle has, over the past several years, demonstrated a considerable willingness to use legal mechanisms to suppress information, punish critics, and control narrative. The lawsuit against Associated Newspapers over the publication of a private letter. The various legal threats issued to journalists, researchers, and commentators. The aggressive management of image rights and content control. This legal aggression has been widely characterized, by those sympathetic to Meghan, as a woman defending herself against a hostile press. And there is genuine truth in the observation that the British press has not always covered Meghan with fairness or proportionality. But here is what sits uncomfortably alongside that truth. The legal mechanisms Meghan has deployed have been extraordinarily selective. She has pursued journalists and publications with considerable vigor when the subject matter relates to her personal correspondence, her relationship with her father, her public image. She has not pursued with anything approaching comparable vigor the people raising questions about the births of her children. Think about what that means. Think about it carefully. If someone falsely accused you of faking a pregnancy, of deceiving the world about the origins of your children, of perpetrating a decade-long fraud on the royal family and the British public, what would you do? You would pursue them through every legal avenue available to you. You would not rest until the allegation was publicly, definitively, and legally demolished. The absence of that response is not nothing. It is potentially everything, and now we arrive at the part of this story that elevates it from extraordinary to historic. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, the man who will one day be king, the man who has spent his entire life being prepared for an institution that he takes, whatever his private feelings, with complete seriousness. William is not a man given to impulsive action. He is not a man who makes demands without calculation. He is not a man who would attach his name, even privately, to a course of action without being convinced of both its necessity and its justification. And yet, according to reports that have emerged through channels with established credibility, William has communicated, through the appropriate constitutional intermediaries, that the question of Archie and Lilibet's biological parentage must be formally resolved, that DNA verification must be pursued, that the line of succession cannot contain individuals whose right to be there has not been independently confirmed. The significance of this cannot be overstated. This is the heir to the throne saying, in effect, that the two children of his estranged brother are not confirmed in his view to be who they have been presented as being. That the evidence available to him, whatever that evidence is, has raised sufficient doubt that the constitutional machinery must be engaged. This is not a family dispute. This is not brotherly conflict dressed in institutional language. This is a future king exercising his responsibility to the institution he will one day lead. And that responsibility requires him to ensure that the line of succession is not compromised by individuals whose presence in it cannot be verified. William understands better than almost anyone alive what the monarchy is and what it requires. It requires, above all else, legitimacy, not popularity, not modernity, not relatability, legitimacy, the unimpeachable legal and biological foundation upon which the entire structure rests. If that foundation has been compromised, even potentially, even theoretically, it must be examined. And it must be examined now, while the king lives, while the institution has the resilience to absorb what examination might reveal, rather than later, when the damage of prolonged concealment would compound the damage of the original deception. What does Meghan Markle do now? This is the question that her considerable team of advisors, lawyers and publicists will be working around the clock to answer. Because the options available to her are narrowing with remarkable speed, she can continue the silence. She can maintain the position that these questions are beneath response, that engaging with them legitimizes them, that the appropriate response to outrageous allegations is dignified quiet. This has been her strategy for years, and it has, to this point, been moderately effective at maintaining plausible deniability in the court of public opinion, but it will not work against formal constitutional processes. Dignified quiet does not satisfy a Privy Council inquiry. It does not respond to a court order. It does not resolve a question that the future monarch has formally raised through legitimate channels. At some point, and that point may be approaching faster than anyone in Montecito is comfortable acknowledging, silence becomes not a strategy but a confession. She can go on the offensive. She can deploy the full machinery of her media operation to characterize the questions as racist, as misogynistic, as a coordinated campaign of harassment by a hostile establishment determined to destroy a black woman who dared to challenge the status quo. She has used this playbook before with considerable success, but this playbook has a weakness, and that weakness is specificity. Accusations of racism and misogyny are powerful tools against vague, subjective criticism. They are considerably less powerful against a request for a DNA test, because a DNA test is not racist. A DNA test is not misogynistic. A DNA test is a biological instrument that does not care about your race, your gender, your narrative, or your Netflix deal. It answers the question it is asked, and it does not negotiate. Or she can do the one thing that would end this story permanently and immediately. She can provide the verification that has been requested. She can open the records, submit to the testing, produce the independent confirmation that should, by rights, have been available from the beginning. The fact that this option does not appear to be under active consideration tells you everything you need to know about what that verification would reveal. There is a broader story here that sits beneath the specific allegations, and it is worth naming directly. The Meghan Markle story has always been at its core a story about the relationship between narrative and truth, about what happens when someone with extraordinary skill at constructing and maintaining narrative encounters an institution built on a different kind of truth entirely, a formal truth, a documented truth, a truth that is not subject to reframing or rebranding or the generous interpretation of sympathetic interviewers. For a long time, narrative won. The interview with Oprah controlled the global conversation for weeks. The Netflix documentary redefined the Sussex story for millions of viewers who accepted it without scrutiny. The book, the podcast, the carefully timed revelations, each one a calculated deployment of narrative designed to stay one step ahead of accountability. But accountability has a quality that narrative lacks. Accountability is patient. It does not need to trend. It does not require an audience or a distribution deal or a sympathetic host. It simply waits. And it waits. And eventually it arrives, not with drama or fanfare, but with paperwork and legal process and the quiet, implacable machinery of institutions that have been doing this for centuries. The British monarchy, for all its dysfunction and all its failures, has been doing this for centuries. It has outlasted smarter adversaries than Meghan Markle. It has absorbed bigger scandals. It has navigated sharper crises. And it has done so because it has, at its disposal, tools that no amount of celebrity and no volume of sympathetic media coverage can ultimately defeat. Those tools are now reportedly in motion. Here is what the next chapter of this story looks like. If the reporting is accurate and the constitutional processes are genuinely engaged, formal requests for documentation will be made through channels that carry legal weight. The Sussex legal team will respond initially with objections rooted in privacy and the welfare of the children. Those objections will be considered because the welfare of children is always a legitimate consideration, and then they will be overruled because the constitutional interest of the Crown outweighs the privacy interest of individuals who have voluntarily claimed a place in the line of succession. At some point, a threshold will be reached where continued resistance becomes legally untenable, where the cost of refusal exceeds the cost of compliance. And at that point, one of two things will happen. The verification will occur, and the results will either confirm the Sussex narrative or they will not. If they confirm it, the story ends with a vindication that Meghan could have had years ago at a fraction of the cost. If they do not confirm it, the consequences will be of a scale that no press release and no public relations strategy can manage. Or the Sussexes will make a decision, perhaps already made, perhaps being made now in Montecito with lawyers and advisors, and the quiet desperation of people who have built everything on a story that is finally running out of road. What that decision looks like, nobody outside that room can say with certainty, but the room is getting smaller, and the road is getting shorter. And the patience of the institution, the real institution, the one that existed before Meghan Markle arrived and will exist long after she is gone, is very nearly at its end. We have been here before in a sense. The monarchy has faced individuals who underestimated it, who mistook its tolerance for weakness, its patience for passivity, its commitment to process for an inability to act. Those individuals, without exception, eventually discovered their mistake. Wallis Simpson discovered it. The monarchy did not bend. The king who loved her abdicated, and the institution continued without missing a constitutional beat. The decades that followed brought further tests, further crises, further moments where it seemed that the weight of modernity and scandal and public disapproval might finally break something that had survived everything else. And each time the institution found its footing. Each time the machinery of continuity ground forward. Meghan Markle is not Wallis Simpson. The comparison flatters both women in different ways and diminishes them in others. But the dynamic is recognizable. The outsider who arrives with a powerful personal narrative and a genuine ability to capture public imagination. The friction with the institution's existing culture and expectations. The escalating conflict. The departure. The ongoing campaign from outside the walls. And now the reckoning, because the reckoning always comes. It is the one thing you can say about the British establishment with complete confidence. It moves slowly, it moves procedurally, it moves with what can look from the outside like indifference or inaction, but it moves, it always moves. And when it arrives with the full weight of centuries of practice behind it. Meghan Markle has many things. She has wealth, platform, lawyers, publicists, allies in the media, and a narrative that has proved remarkably resilient. She has a husband who has sacrificed everything for her version of events, and shows no current signs of reconsidering. Meghan Markle arrived at the British royal family as a highly trained, professionally experienced, personally ambitious performer. And the royal family, which had spent decades dealing with the relatively straightforward psychology of people born into the institution, was entirely unprepared for what that meant. The courtship and engagement were, by most accounts, a masterclass in exactly the kind of performance we are discussing. The warmth, the apparent sincerity, the carefully calibrated vulnerability that made Harry feel, reportedly, that he was finally understood by someone outside the gilded cage he had always resented. The way she navigated the initial meetings with the royal family, deploying just the right combination of deference and confidence to seem both respectful of the institution and refreshingly unburdened by its more archaic expectations. Those who were present at those early interactions describe, in the retrospective accounts that have trickled out over the years, a woman who was always watching, always reading the room, always calculating the next move while appearing to be completely present in the current one. This is, on one level, simply intelligence, emotional intelligence of a high order. The ability to read social dynamics and respond to them appropriately is a gift, not a flaw, but there is a version of that gift that becomes something else when it is deployed without moral constraint. When the reading of the room is not in service of genuine connection, but in service of extraction. When the warmth is instrumental rather than felt, when the vulnerability is performed rather than experienced, that version of the gift is what multiple palace insiders, speaking carefully and often anonymously, have described over the past several years. A woman who could turn the warmth on and off with a precision that was, to those who witnessed it, frankly unsettling. Who could be radiantly charming in front of a camera and something considerably colder the moment it stopped rolling. Who had a story she was telling, and who understood with professional expertise that the story required consistent performance to remain convincing. Now, let us talk about the pregnancy, because the pregnancy is where the story begins to crack, where the first hairline fractures appear in the foundation of the narrative, where people begin to look at each other with the particular expression that says, "I thought it was just me, but apparently it is not just me." By the time Meghan announced she was expecting in Australia in October 2018, she was, by her own account, several months along. The dates have always been somewhat fluid in the Sussex telling, which is itself worth noting, but let us take the announced timeline at face value and work forward from there. What followed over the next several months was a pregnancy unlike any that had been observed in the modern history of the royal family. And I do not mean unlike in the sense of being more modern, more relaxed, less bound by protocol. I mean unlike in the sense that the physical evidence of pregnancy behaved in ways that medical and biological reality cannot comfortably accommodate. The bump, as it has been discussed exhaustively by observers ranging from curious members of the public to qualified medical professionals, was anomalous. The word anomalous is chosen carefully because it is accurate without being irresponsible. Anomalous means deviating from what is standard, normal, or expected. And by the standard of what pregnancy looks like when observed and photographed extensively over several months, Meghan's bump was anomalous. It was not simply a matter of size variation. Size variation in pregnancy is entirely normal and well documented. It was not simply a matter of clothing creating different visual impressions. Again, this is a real and well understood phenomenon. It was the behavior. The way the profile changed not over days but over hours. The way certain physical positions were adopted that are genuinely incompatible with the structural reality of a third trimester pregnancy. The way the body, in unguarded moments caught on camera, moved with a freedom and ease that simply does not coexist with a full-term pregnancy. The medical professionals who raised these concerns publicly did so carefully and with appropriate qualification. They were not claiming certainty. They were noting that what they were observing was inconsistent with their professional experience of how pregnant bodies behave. That is a significant observation when it comes from people whose professional experience is directly relevant, and it was an observation that was never addressed, never refuted with the kind of specific, clinical, medically grounded explanation that would have been both possible and straightforward to provide. Instead, it was dismissed, mocked, and the people making it were characterized in the manner that has become Meghan's default response to scrutiny of any kind, as haters, as racists, as misogynists too threatened by a powerful woman to allow her to simply exist. The characterization of the questioner is not the answer to the question. And the question remained: what happened on the 6th of May 2019 is, depending on your perspective, either the birth of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor or the most audacious single moment in a decade-long performance. The facts, such as they are these. The Duchess of Sussex was reportedly admitted to hospital in the early hours of the morning. No public announcement was made of this at the time, which was itself a departure from established royal practice. The birth was announced later that morning. The location of the birth was not immediately confirmed, and subsequent attempts to verify it produced conflicting information that was never definitively resolved. No attending physician made a public statement. No hospital provided independent confirmation of the birth in the manner that is standard for public figures of this prominence. The subsequent presentation of the baby to the world happened days later, in controlled conditions, inside Windsor Castle, with a guest list and a visual narrative that had been planned and managed with the precision of a professional production. The footage and photographs from that presentation became, almost immediately, the subject of the same kind of observation that the pregnancy photographs had attracted. The way the baby was held, the body language of the mother. The absence of the physical and emotional rawness that tends to characterize new mothers in the first days of their child's life, particularly when those new mothers are performing for cameras in front of a watching world. These observations do not constitute proof of anything. Let that be clearly stated. Observation is not evidence. Pattern recognition is not confirmation. But observation and pattern recognition are the legitimate beginning of inquiry. And inquiry in this case has been systematically obstructed at every turn. That obstruction is itself a data point, a significant one. Lilibet Diana arrived, or was announced as arriving, in June 2021, and the circumstances of her birth crystallized everything that had been uncertain about Archie's. By this point, the Sussexes had left the royal family. They had moved to California. They had given the Oprah interview. They had, in other words, positioned themselves explicitly as private individuals who retained royal titles and royal adjacency, while claiming the protections of private life when scrutiny became inconvenient. The birth announcement came through their press operation. It named the baby. It described the birth as healthy. It provided no independent verification of any kind. In the days and weeks that followed, the same pattern that had characterized the period after Archie's birth repeated itself. Controlled information, managed imagery, no independent confirmation, no medical voices, no hospital statement, nothing that existed outside the bubble of the Sussex communications machine. Now consider the position this creates. 2 children, both in the line of succession to the British throne, both announced through a single, interested party's press operation. Neither birth independently confirmed by any external authority. Neither child's existence verified by any institution or individual operating outside the Sussex sphere of control. In a private family, this would be, as has been said before, entirely their right. But in a family that retains a place in the constitutional order of the United Kingdom, it is not simply a matter of personal preference. It is a matter of institutional integrity. And institutional integrity has rules that do not bend to accommodate personal narratives. However skillfully those narratives are constructed, and maintained, the question of surrogacy sits at the heart of all of this, and it is time to examine it with the directness it deserves. Gestational surrogacy, in which a surrogate carries an embryo that is not genetically hers, is a legitimate, legal, and increasingly common path to parenthood. This is not in dispute. The practice exists, it is regulated in most jurisdictions, and it enables families to form who might otherwise be unable to do so. There is no moral judgment attached to surrogacy as a choice. The moral judgment attaches to the concealment of it when concealment is used to deceive others for personal gain.